continuing Pelleas and Ettarre from King Arthur and His Knights by Elizabeth Lodor Merchant. "Ha, Sir Sleepyhead," said the Silver Knight, "whence do you come, and what are you called, that you sleep in the path of those who go to Arthur's tournament?" "I am named Pelleas," stammered the youth, awkwardly enough as he rubbed his eyes. "And in the country in which I was born, I am called Lord of the Isles. My way also lies to Arthur's tournament. It is no place for sleepy boys," said the knight scornfully, "but perhaps the great Lord of the Isles can show the road to men who know the knightly art, and to these fair ladies who delight in valorous deeds. As his reward tomorrow, he will learn, standing among the commons at the lists, how men of valor joust, so that he can return to his own native isles to practice safely with a broomstick at the quintain the arts he has observed. I go to joust, not to watch," replied Pelleas proudly, "as you may find tomorrow." "What, boy?" exclaimed the knight, advancing menacingly towards him. At this a lady, who seemed to be the leader of the party, rode quickly forward and placed herself between the men. "Back!" she commanded. Well, that's not a very feminine voice, but "it is the way to treat a stranger knight, whose worship, for all you know, may be greater than your own." Then, turning to Pelleas, she said, with a winning smile, "Fair youth, of your courtesy, direct our band of weary travelers to Caerleon." So beautiful and so gracious was she, that all the anger which the knight's insolence had aroused in Pelleas vanished like mists before the morning sun. He led the party past the edge of the thicket, and, with his eyes still on the lovely lady, pointed to the castle in the valley below. But long after they had gone, the beauty of the lady remained in Pelleas's thoughts. The more he thought of her, the greater her beauty seemed. He vowed that he would win the circlet and set it upon her forehead, and, if possible, that he would wipe out in the lists the insult of the discourteous knight of the 3 Roses. The cavalcade wound in and out among the trees, down the winding road that led to Caerleon, and Pelleas followed it with his eyes until it was hidden by the foliage. When the sun, resting on the horizon, promised speedy darkness, he too rode down into the valley. Straight through the little city he rode, and into the courtyard of the king's castle. There dismounting, he came into the presence of the king, and Arthur, who welcomed all strangers, received him right courteously. As this strong and handsome lad told his straightforward, manly story, and earnestly begged that he might receive knighthood from the king's own hands, the wise Arthur thought that never had he seen a youth more worthy of the high vows. He willingly granted Pelleas's request, and causing him to kneel before him, delivered the accolade, or sword blow, on the shoulder. Then he put to him the high vow of the order, in the presence of all the round table, and of the many stranger knights who had come to the tournament, and were paying honor to the king. To some, the vow might be a mere formula to be interpreted as each knight thought best, but to Pelleas, filled with ideals, it was an oath to be literally observed. Well, figuratively all you want, but when you got literal pacts, as he withdrew from the royal presence, he walked in an exalted ecstasy, not of pride, but rather of duty. He accepted knighthood, not as an honor, but as a sacred pledge to do what he might in the cause of right, with unflinching courage and untiring ardor, to keep his honor unstained, to protect the weak, to be loyal and gentle and courteous. These were the goals towards which he must henceforth strive. All night he spent in solitary prayer in the chapel. Clad in a long white robe, his armor piled before the high altar, he prayed that he might be worthy of the honor he had received and strong to attain the ideals of his vow. If the face of the fair lady whom he had seen that afternoon sometimes came between him and the flickering candles of the altar, we must remember that he was but a boy, bred in a rude and remote land, where he had met but few women. He could not be expected to see what others would have said was a little cold, a little cruel, a little worldly in her face. Besides, she too was an ideal, and an ideal is but a reality whose meaner features are hidden by a gilding of enthusiasm. And this is why there's not such a thing as love at first sight. Well, certain type of love, right? But a lasting love, you know, it's, you really got to know the person. A motley, milling crowd fills Caerleon. It is the first day of the great tournament. Noble and simple, priest and cutpurse, bowman and smith, merchant, mountebank, throng the narrow streets of the little town and the fields surrounding the lists. The inns and wine shops are filled with revelers. Peddlers hawk their wares among the crowd. Little booths of green branches are set up here and there, where refreshment may be had by the thirsty or the hungry. Song, laughter, noise, confusion are everywhere. On the outskirts of the town are herded droves of cattle, sheep and pigs, which are to supply food for the throng attending the tournament. Some of the more tardy are yet coming along the roads amid clouds of dust, to the great inconvenience of travelers and to the greater inconvenience of their drivers. When some haughty noble rides recklessly through the flock, followed by his laughing or swearing retainers, large crowds, or little knots of spectators, loiter about the hawkers and tumblers at the street corners, as the entertainment they afford is more or less amusing. The vendors of relics of saints have disposed of enough pig and sheep bones to the superstitious to fill a respectable cemetery. And the hawkers of magical ointments, which will cure all ills, have taken from the trusting country folk more money than they have had in their pouches for many a 12-month. About the lists, little colonies of tents of all the colors of the rainbow are set up, each with its owner's shield near the door. The pages and armorers scurry about the camp on 1,000 errands, with many collisions, much swearing, more joking, and an occasional fight. Pay attention to where you're walking, much less running, not much less running, but much more so the case when you run. But people have accidents, so be ready to forgive with some of that, right? Now a latecomer to the jousts rides into the narrow streets, his brilliant retinue trailing behind him. After his supporters and men-at-arms comes a lumbering baggage train. He rides haughtily through the crowded street, paying no more attention to the commons who crowd against the walls to let him pass than if they were so many ants. Now and again, his purse-bearer hurls a handful of small coins into the mob, and a general scramble, and many a broken head is left in the wake of the cavalcade. Men-at-arms pass with the devil may-care swagger. Priests and monks shuffle along on wooden sandals or ride past on sleepy donkeys. Presently a knight-errant in worn and dented armor jangles through the throng and sends the crowd flying to right and left to let him pass. He rides alone or perchance with a solitary squire, but the romance of his mode of life appeals to the commons, and they bear his boisterous recklessness and haughty condescension with wide-eyed respect. Through such a motley crowd, Pelleas forces his way to the lists, alone, unknown, untried, and only last night knighted by Arthur's grace. He sits his horse in true knightly fashion, however, and the bright eyes of many a fair lady follow his well-knit figure as he rides along. When Pelleas arrives at the lists, the spectators have already assembled. At one end of the field are seats for the king. The ladies and such of the knights are not to take part in the tournament. Outside the fence, which surrounds the field, is the crowd, struggling to secure places near the barrier or retain the places already won. Behind the crowd rise the tents of the contestants, joyous in their bright coloring and fluttering plumes. Presently there is a stir among the spectators. A silence falls on the babble of jest, banter, and squabbling, in which the commons are indulging, as the heralds, with the royal arms upon their tabards and embroidered richly upon their hangings of their trumpets, advance into the arena, blow a flourish, and formally announce the opening of the tournament, the prizes and the contestants, the last being done with much circumstance and repetition of titles of those who are to compete, is hardly welcome to the mob. They have come to see action. Long ere the heralds have finished, their voices are lost in a din of catcalls, but at last the catalogue is done, and another blast on the trumpets, announcing the beginning of the jousts, is greeted with noisy approval by the commons. Suddenly 2 gates at either end of the field are thrown open, and a band of knights rides into each end of the enclosure. Truly, it is a noble scene. The armor of knights and horses shines in the sunlight. The plumes upon the helmets dance in the light breeze. Painted shields, gleaming ruddy and green and azure, are reflecting the colors of the precious metals. Show an array of strange devices hardly to be conceived except in a dream. Armor clanks and jangles as the chargers paw and cavort in their eagerness for the fray. All is motion, color, and noise. The knights at each end of the list lower their blunted, tilting spears and set the butts in the rest. Set the butts in the rests. Okay. You know, the end of the flat end of the sword. There is a sharp signal from the heralds. With a wild scramble of horses, the 2 lines hurtle towards each other. Each knight chooses his opponent, and as they meet, horses and men go down upon the sod. Shattered spears fly from mailed hands. Shivered shields drop useless to the ground. Those who remain horsed dash on to the end of the lists, opposed their starting place. Wheel and prepare for another onslaught. Squires rush to their masters with fresh spears to replace the broken ones, or to drag from the field those who have fallen and because of the weight of their armor are unable to rise. Again they charge. In lessened numbers, the 2 lines close, and more go down. Again and again they repeat the maneuver until but 2 of the company are left, 1 from each side. Their horses are jaded, and the knights are plainly tired, but they take their places. Truly, it is a meeting of heroes, for one has already outhorsed 19 of his opponents, and the other nearly as many. The arms of one are well known, the hero of 100 jousts. The shield of the other bears no device. The mystery of the unknown knight whets the curiosity of the crowd, quite as much as his prowess. Some say it is the great Lancelot, riding disguised. As he passes, ladies wave their scarves, and the commons howl their approval. Even the king leans forward. Beside the queen sits a fair lady, whom she calls Ettarre. It is she who since yesterday has enslaved Pelleas. As the unknown knight passes, he turns towards her and raises the visor of his helmet. It is Pelleas. Pelleas and his adversary are again at the ends of the lists. The jaded horses summon all their strength. With a shout, the knights are off. There is no sound save the thud of galloping hooves. The spectators hold their breaths for this final struggle. Nearer and nearer draw the horses. More and more tense grow the watchers. A crash. They have met, and both reel in their saddles. The joyous shield of Pelleas' rival splits on the point of the young knight's lance. Pelleas throws away his own shield, and the two wheel to meet again. Pelleas drives the spear against his opponent's helmet. The stricken man rises in his saddle, clutches wildly at the air. Off he goes over his charger's tail, and falls with a resounding crash upon the ground. There he lies, stunned, while his horse gallops madly down the field. The day's tournament is over. Pelleas, the untried knight, has won the day. 100 hands stretch up to help him from his horse. A host of ladies look admiringly upon him. The commons press forward over the barrier to catch a glimpse of the doer of such marvelous deeds. He rides slowly to the king, bows before him, and receives his praise. Then slowly he rides from the lists. We're in such an age where it's not good to bow to any man, but then slowly he rides from the lists. Several young knights ride beside him, pressing him to take them in his train, and the rabble follows on foot, cheering their hero. The second day in the lists he found Pelleas a greater hero than before, and when he had repeated his performance of the day before, there was little question among the spectators that he would win the sword and circlet. So it came about. And when the prize was bestowed, Pelleas rode to Ettarre and placed the circlet upon her head. No doubt the lady was flattered, for she received the honor graciously, yet perhaps with a bit of condescension, as one who honors the giver in accepting his gift. However, for Pelleas, his queen could do no wrong. He sat down to his own unworthiness and to his inexperience and the ways of courts, the somewhat flippant, half-contemptuous air which Ettarre showed towards himself. As for Ettarre, while it was very pleasant publicly to receive the homage of this brilliant young knight, whose prowess had amazed the court, and whose favor every lady was anxious to win, it was quite another matter to endure the wooing of this awkward country bumpkin, as she suspected him to be, which she felt sure would follow any too cordial display of gratification on her part. Well, just because you're awkward around someone doesn't mean you're a hick. As has been remarked before, those who knew Ettarre knew her to be a cold and selfish woman. Now indeed she showed these traits. She gladly accepted the circlet and the plaudits of the throng which accompanied it. But their giver she treated coldly, and held at arm's length. The ardent youth was hurt and disappointed by her coldness, but filled with the determination which had carried him through the joust. He resolved to win her respect at last, cost what the effort might. And now the visitors began to disperse. Long cavalcades of knights and ladies wound over the hills, prolonging their holiday with song and laughter as they rode homewards. Knots and bands of the commons thronged the roads, diverting their journey with noisy jest and clownish horseplay. But everywhere, among both gentle and simple, the prowess of the young knight, Pelleas, was the chief topic of conversation. So modest and so courteous was he, withal, that he had made himself beloved by everyone. By all, no one would gladly have thrust him from her thoughts, as she had repulsed him from her presence. Ettarre, whose smile he most desired, hated him without reason and against all reason, as she was forced to acknowledge herself. And since she had hated him, in her selfishness, she would willingly have had him killed to rid herself of his persistent court. She spared him no slight, no humiliation. As she rode homeward among her ladies and her knights, free of him for the time, she plotted how she might rid herself of him when he should seek her out, as she was sure he would, and what insults she might heap upon his devoted head. Okay, well, if the guy was inexperienced, certainly he could be trained to be closer to what she wanted in some regards than, had he been some super experienced guy that's set in his ways. Meanwhile, Pelleas too was betaking himself to Caerleon. He also now headed a cavalcade for several young knights had attached themselves to him. Besides them were harnesses and horses of the conquered knights. He traveled with a heavy heart. So infatuated was he by the beauty of the Lady Ettarre that her face was continually before him, although her cruelty smote him to the soul. And so these two, who should have left the tournament the happiest of all the throng, were the saddest and the most miserable. At last Ettarre arrived at her castle, and, in the gaiety of her court, strove to forget her persistent lover. Days passed, and he did not appear. Perhaps amid her satisfaction she felt a bit piqued, and that had not followed her as she had expected he would. That he had not followed as she expected he would. Is it piquerism when you stab people but don't kill people? Is that where it's from? Like pinpricking people, that sort of. Perhaps in the more solitary castle life, removed from the greater splendor and the constantly changing faces of Caerleon, she would have liked to see the ardent young knight and amuse herself by teasing him and humiliating him. At any rate, time hung heavily on her hands. So one day, as relief from the tedium of being shut up in the castle, she set out, accompanied by the courtiers, upon a ride through the forest. The party wound over the hills and among the great trees pleasantly enough for some time, and at length came to a little clearing on the banks of a small deep lake. Great was their surprise to see, as they approached it, a cluster of bright tents, and greater still was their surprise when from the camp rode out Pelleas, clad in gleaming new armor, and sitting his charger with courtly grace. He might well have won the approval of the most fastidious lady, but to Ettarre his presence was a challenge which she was quick to accept. "How now, Sir Pelleas?" she cried. "By what right do you trespass in our domain? The sight of you is hateful to me, as you know full well, and if you leave it not at once bitterly, shall you rue your presumption." Rue is a good herb. "Lady," replied Pelleas, "I yet will win your love. Blinded by some witchery, you will not now listen to my suit, but I will break the spell by my devotion and by my patient faithfulness. Think you, because by luck or by perchance by aid of wizardry, you won the circlet at the tournament, you can in fair fight overcome my knights?" retorted Ettarre. "Begone, or I will harry you to the land's end." While she was speaking, several of her knights had drawn into a rather wide circle about Pelleas, and with hand on spear watched narrowly their lady for any signal of action. It was a treacherous and unknightly maneuver, but one which might be looked for from the followers of Ettarre. Ettarre worked herself into higher and higher rage. His patient courtesy, through all her tirade, incensed her beyond endurance. At last, trembling with wrath, she threw her hand towards Pelleas. "Seize him!" she screamed. With a bound, the waiting knights sprang forward. Surrounded on every side, the young knight's actions were as quick and telling as those of a cornered cat. He was helped by the rocky and tree-studded nature of the field, which interfered with a concerted action by his antagonists, and by the fact that his horse was fresher than theirs, which had been ridden many a weary mile. Pelleas, with soldierly instinct, was quick to take advantage of all these things. To his left the ground was marshy, and the heavy-laden horses would have difficulty in forcing their way through the long grass and thick underbrush. To his right, a steep, gravely slope, by some 8 or 10 feet, screened at its top by shrubbery, dropped sharply to the shore of the lake. Behind him a small brook ran from the marsh down to the lake, over a stony, precipitous bed. Before him the clearing extended for some distance, its floor at the further end being encumbered with fallen trees and rotted trunks, which gave an insecure and treacherous footing for the horses. Like the good soldier he was, Pelleas saw these things at a glance. At the first signal of battle, the lover became the fighter, and his strategy was settled upon. Wheeling sharply to the right, he charged the 2 horsemen approaching from that side. The stream behind him and the marsh prevented quick action by his adversaries from those directions, and the broken nature of the ground prevented the knights in front of his former position from changing the course of their charge quickly enough to intercept him. Pelleas was charging the knights on the lake side from a position in front of and a little to the left of them. While this left him in a good position to use his lance, his opponents were hampered, since the spear was carried in the right hand, by having their horses' necks between the weapon and their adversary. The lances were too heavy to be used effectively outside the rest, and the horses were too heavily armored to permit of quick maneuvering. On such uneven ground, Pelleas thundered upon them. Their horses, stumbling over the vine-covered stones, collided just as Pelleas's spear point met the shield of the nearer knight. Horses and riders were thrown backward into the underbrush. The crumbling bank gave way, and their steeds and riders rolled down the bank to the shore, and their armor was too heavy to let them climb the sandy bank in time to assist their comrades, and although only bruised and shaken by the fall, they were effectually removed from the remainder of the battle. Meantime, the knights who had at first faced Pelleas had ridden past him, carried by the impetus of their charge almost to the brook, and the knights in the marsh had scrambled to solid ground. These last, Pelleas, circling to the left, attacked upon their left flank. Here again he had so maneuvered that he was safe from their attack. While they must receive his lance in a position which not only made counter-attack impossible, but defense difficult, they gave way and galloped in confusion after their companions, frightening their comrades' horses, and packing all 4 knights upon the point of firm ground which ran between the stream and the sandbank by the lake. They were too closely packed to permit the effective use of their arms, and retreat was cut off by the steep and slippery bed of the stream and by the precipitous gravel bank. One determined charge by Pelleas, and they would be thrown into confusion. Probably some of them would have been cast over the embankment or into the stream. Then, while they were still in disorder, he could have subdued them